stability, investment and reform. These are the three pillars for growth set out by Shadow Chancellor Rachel Reeves in her Mais Lecture to business and finance leaders earlier this week.
I suggest that the answer today is an economic approach which recognises how our world has changed. Building growth on strong and secure foundations, with active government, guided by three imperatives.
Hello, I'm Anoosh Chakelian, Britain editor at the New Statesman and host of this podcast. And joining me in the studio, I have George Eaton, our senior editor, and Freddie Hayward, our political correspondent. Now, George and Freddie, you were both there on Tuesday evening at the Bayes Business School, I think in City University, just north of the City of London, where Rachel Reeves was giving the Mais Lecture. Before we get into the nuts and bolts of it, who was there? Who wasn't there? What's the audience for this thing?
So it was a mixture of academics, thinkers from the policy world, people like Torsten Bell of the Resolution Foundation, other prominent think tankers, journalists, and then some shadow cabinet members as well. Darren Jones, shadow chief secretary to the Treasury, was there, but not a big audience. But I think the significant thing with the lecture is how prestigious it is. So it's previously been delivered by the likes of Gordon Brown, Tony Blair, Nigel Lawson. Rishi Sunak delivered one as Chancellor, Mark Carney. And it's probably the biggest chance that a Chancellor or Shadow Chancellor gets to set out their economic philosophy. And I think Rachel Reeves has actually exceeded expectations in terms of just how ambitious it was. I think probably it was the most comprehensive statement of centre-left economic policy for a generation. Now, there are things that people will agree or disagree within it, but I think it's hard to think of an address that someone in that position has delivered in recent times that has been that sort of ambitious and wide-ranging.
That's really interesting, and we'll get into exactly what she said. But what was striking in the build-up to the lecture was these parallels that were being drawn between her and Margaret Thatcher, because she talked about the end of the 1970s, spoke of a decade of national renewal, kind of echoing that language about Thatcher. And it's not the first time she's done that, because do you remember at Labour conference last year, she talked about iron discipline, but it was almost like she wanted to be written up as the Iron Chancellor, echoing that language of the Iron Lady. And I think, Freddie, you and I were at that Q&A that she did sort of on the conference fringe, where she did actually sort of say that she owed a bit of a debt to Thatcher in terms of, a consensus defining leader. So it's not the first time. But I mean, what did she actually say in the lecture about Thatcherism and Nigel Lawson?
Yeah, so this was written up in the Telegraph and the Times as Rachel Reeves saying that she was going to be the next Margaret Thatcher. I don't think that's what she was saying at all. She was very clear that 1979 was a turning point. It was a pivotal moment where British history went in a certain direction, and I think she was trying to draw a parallel between that and today. I think she was also quite explicit that she disagreed with what Thatcher did in the 80s. She talked about the fact that we need broad-based and inclusive growth, not like the growth that we had back then.
I joined the Labour Party because I disagreed with so much of what Margaret Thatcher did to Britain in the 1980s.
You always get these briefings that come up before, everyone writes them up, they talk about it, and that gets the focus. And then, 6-8 hours later, you get the 8,000 word speech where it's this tiny little subclause. They do that on purpose so that they can get a nice Telegraph front page. But it's not really what she was saying.
Yeah, and actually, if anything, far from taking a Thatcherite approach, it was a sort of rejection of New Labour economics, wasn't it, George? You wrote this up for the website.
That's one of the things that jumped out at me. Now, there have always been clear dividing lines between Starmer's project and New Labour, but I think Rachel Reeves put it more explicitly than in the past, partly because she had the length to do so. Yeah. And she essentially said New Labour had big successes on public service investment, poverty reduction, but it was too indulgent of globalisation. Too relaxed about market forces, that the flexible labour market that it celebrated too often meant insecurity for workers. And she also then linked that to her policy prescriptions. So she came out with a strong defence of Labour's New Deal for working people, reaffirmed the commitment to abolish 0 hours contracts, to give all workers full rights from day one on sick pay, parental leave, protection against unfair dismissal, and so on. She spoke of the importance of public ownership with GB Energy, sovereign wealth funds, and the importance of green investment. Now, Labour has scaled back its green investment programme from the 28 billion, but the fiscal rules are still designed to allow for much more ambitious investment than the Conservatives. Now, some of this is stated in quite cautious terms at the moment because they're in opposition. They're trying to win an election. Obviously, I think a lot depends on the economic circumstances once they're in power, as to how radical or how cautious they are. But there are clear distinctions with New Labour, but also with the Corbyn project. The language on business, much more conciliatory. They see business as a genuine partner rather than an adversary. But I think those who write up Starmer and Reeves as Blairism 2.0 are sort of making a fundamental error. And you see that very clearly if you read the speech.
Yeah, and actually our listeners should definitely read your piece on that aspect of the speech as well. It's really good. And Freddie, George mentioned the fiscal rules. I know this is something that's exercised you for a while. She sort of clarified a bit more what Labour's actual fiscal rules are and how similar they are to the government's. Can you tell us exactly?
Yeah, so we got that 5-year debt reduction figure, which means that they're going to have debt falling in the 5th year of the forecast. It's not debt will be lower in the 5th year than in the first year. It's this that it starts to fall in the 5th.
Okay.
So that's the rule. So, and this is huge. I think it's going to completely dictate what they have to do and what they must do and what they can't do in their first term. We've got to remember that if we look at the budget recently, it was that headroom that we heard so much about. That was what dictated by the fiscal rules, and it's why Jeremy Hunt could or could not do the tax cuts that he wanted. So what does it mean for Labour? I think when they get in, or if they get in, they're going to be faced by these spending cuts, these penciled in spending cuts, which are a consequence of the government's fiscal rules. They've essentially, by signing up to the fiscal rules, signed up to those cuts.
And that's £19 billion worth of cuts to departments that aren't
protected. So let's see how that changes. That might change depending on the economic weather. But they're going to have to deal with that in some form. So their solution is growth. We're going to get out of this twist, out of this difficulty by growing the economy. Well, if they're going to do so, these cuts are coming in 24, 25, 25, 26. It means they have to have such an urgency when it comes to growing the economy and getting that extra bit of headroom so that they don't have to do the cuts. Now, how do you get the growth? We heard a lot about that in the speech. The key thing in the short term seems to be planning, because they're not going to be able to do the huge amount of public investment that they want immediately. They're going to ramp up to that, as they said, and it's a lot less than it was before we got the U-turn on the 28 billion. So you've got this planning reform, and I think there is some concern within Labour that however quickly you get approval for planning, I think some people think they're going to come in and just go through all of the awaiting approvals and just tick them all off. But even if they do that, you've still got to build the thing. I've been speaking to quite a few planners recently. They still go, well, even if you get permission, it takes years to build it. There's some concerns over supplies. There's concerns over labour in the industry. There's concerns over a lack of competition. There's concerns over how and where you're going to build these new garden cities. What projects have the government approved are you going to keep going with? So I think they've essentially created a fiscal straitjacket, and it is that requires them to act extremely swiftly. And if you ask Labour figures, well, what happens if you don't get growth? Then they don't really want to contemplate it. Yeah,
and she was talking about this switch from the language of public investment into private investment as well. I mean, how big is that part of Labour's prospectus?
I think they see private investment as potentially crucial, because the analysis is that because of the incredible instability of British politics since 2016, in particular with Brexit, multiple prime ministers, there is this private investment that's just sitting there, and they haven't got the security they need to invest. So there's an idea that Labour would have a stability dividend, that simply by entering government, if you look at the polls, with a big majority, they could say, look, we're going to have a 5-year government. You now have the political stability you need to know that you're going to invest.
Yeah, that's really interesting, the stability thing, because I find from Labour figures that I speak to, there is this kind of bit of a blind optimism that when they get in, just because they represent a sort of new, more stable order, that will give them a premium in some way. But that's not really a policy, is it, Freddie? I think you wrote in Morning Call that it doesn't necessarily constitute change in itself, does it?
No, this was her response to one of the questions after the speech. How on earth is stability something new? And she said, well, stability has changed because, as you said, George, we've had such instability and chaos over the past 6 years. But I think it's hard to say that we had really strong, instability, rampant instability in 2014, for instance. We had the referendum in Scotland, sure, but we had a chancellor and a prime minister who had quite a clear economic plan, and they delivered that over a long period of time.
And with the Lib Dems, they had quite a decent majority as well.
Exactly. Yeah. So I don't think that that's enough. maybe they're just trying to return to that baseline upon which they can think about something new and trying to go in a new direction. But I think the key thing about the speech was the disjuncture between the ambition of what she hopes to achieve, and she spoke about creating a new economic consensus. She says she was going to get rid of the decline of the country. These were huge, ambitious goals. And then if you look at the ways in which she wants to achieve that, it's not as ambitious at all. It's actually quite familiar. She's going to adopt the government's fiscal framework. We are going to get some changes, as you said, George, over how they measure investment in the deficit versus other spending. We are going to hopefully maybe get some changes in the way in which the OBR measures long-term investment and the impact on growth. But these aren't radical ways in which you're going to achieve this new economic consensus. So I think the next question is, will this be forced upon Labour? Are they reacting to the general global shift? She spoke, interestingly, about a new Washington consensus. So we got to remember that Labour see themselves in the context of Biden and what he's been doing with the IRA over there and subsidies for green technologies. Rachel Reeves looks to Janet Yellen, the Treasury Secretary there, a lot. So I think they feel as if they're in a global movement away from this, you can call it the neoliberal settlement of the past 40 years. And I almost think they don't think they have to do too much to achieve this new consensus because it's happening anyway.
Right, okay. And that always confuses me because we've written a lot at the New Statesman about Reeves's neologism, securonomics.
Yeah.
And that comes from, those visits that she's made to the States and Bidenomics and the middle out ideas. But then the stimulus isn't there to back it up in Labour's plans as it stands. Okay, they still want to... they U-turned on the 28 billion, but there's still sort of 4 or 5 billion there that they want to spend a year on this transition to a new green economy. But is it Bidenomics without the money?
Yes, I think that is the serious critique of it. It's not that this is just empty rhetoric. It's just Blairism 2.0. The serious critique is that the US analogy is not a useful or helpful one because the US is still the world's superpower. It has the might of the dollar, the world's reserve currency. It has far greater power than the UK to shape global events to its advantage. And then because the Inflation Reduction Act had nearly $400 billion of green investment, Labour is promising now across the Parliament only around 24 billion of new investment. Now that may change in power, but the big question is, what is Labour's strategy if they don't get growth as quickly as they hope? When I put this to a shadow cabinet member recently, they said, we hope to succeed. But I was saying, if growth disappoints and you don't get the extra money you want for public services from that, are you going to raise taxes? Now that is the big unanswered question, which is that what is their plan B if plan A doesn't work? And I think that's where you really learn throughout history. That's how you really learn the nature of governments. They're shaped by the choices they make when they have those dilemmas. Do you double down on your program, or do you change course to get the results you originally hoped for?
This is interesting, isn't it? Because she speaks as if stability is within her gift, when actually the past 6 years has shown that you can't control what happens in the Red Sea or Ukraine or Europe or the Middle East or whatever it might be. You can't control inflation, global inflation, or what happens to the supply chain. So I think it's not enough for Labour to say we're going to bring about stability again, because things might happen.
Yeah, and just lastly, how different is this to the Tories' economic agenda? It wasn't that long ago that Rishi Sunak himself was giving the Mais Lecture. And obviously, a lot of the criticism that they get from the left of the party is that they're mirroring sort of Tory spending plans too much and the Tory sort of economic consensus.
Well, I think here's the dividing line, and it's often quite subtle. But the Tories are going as big as they can on tax cuts. Yes, the overall tax take is still rising, but they're now raising the possibility of abolishing national insurance. It's clear that they're going to have a big offer on tax cuts at the election in the manifesto. If you listen to Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer, they're constantly dropping hints that they would actually prioritise public services. Keir Starmer says, look, Labour governments always invest in public services. And what they're saying there is, yes, we will have to accept the tax cuts that the Tories make, personal tax cuts. There's a cost of living crisis. We're not going to reverse those. That's a natural electoral position. But once they're in power, it's very clear, if they have the proceeds of growth to spend, they're going to prioritise public services, not further tax cuts. So I think that is the clear dividing line. It's worth remembering on New Labour. It gets praised a lot, obviously, for its record on public service investment. But the first 2 years, they stuck to the Conservative spending plans. It was only after that, after they'd sort of reassured the markets, reassured Middle England, as they would see it, that we're not going to bankrupt Britain, that they really turned the spending taps on. The big advantage they had was that this was the 1990s, the noughties, when growth was much higher. So I think that is the real worry for Labour.
Thanks so much for watching. We'd love to know what you think. Please make sure you leave your comments below. And if you enjoyed watching this podcast, you can watch more of our videos on our YouTube channel. And don't forget to like and subscribe.